The moment I stepped into the dim apartment, the air hit me like a confession left to rot. Lena stood by the kitchen counter, trembling slightly, pretending not to. She looked up at me with hazel eyes that once felt like home, but tonight they held something darker. Something she tried to bury before I could see it. "We just talked all night," she said, her voice steady, but her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. The clock behind her ticked too loudly, each second scraping against the silence we used to fill with laughter. I smelled rain on her coat, even though it hadn't rained in our part of town. A heartbeat stumbled in my chest as I stepped closer, seeing the tiny smear of smeared lipstick she'd missed. My thoughts spiraled. Would you forgive someone if the truth was worse than the lie? I reached for her hand, but she flinched. So small a movement, she must have hoped I'd miss it. I didn't. In that tiny break, the night cracked open, and suddenly, I needed to know what she was really running from. The quiet didn't settle. It prowled. Ethan felt it crawling beneath his skin, whispering doubts he wished he could outrun. Lena kept brushing her hair behind her ear, a nervous habit she used to hide excitement. But tonight it masked fear. She told him the conversation she had with her old friend was harmless, but her voice wavered at all the wrong moments. The apartment smelled like a stranger's cologne mixed with the faint citrus of her perfume, an impossible blend that twisted Ethan's stomach. Every second that passed pushed them further apart, as though the night itself wanted to expose them. He tried to speak, but the words curdled in his throat. What if betrayal was the only way to survive? The thought struck like a cold draft sneaking through the doorframe. She finally met his eyes, but all he saw was someone bracing for impact. Ethan walked past Lena toward the window, needing distance even though it hurt him to create it. Outside, the street lamps glowed over empty sidewalks, a world that felt simpler than the one inside. He pressed his palm to the cool glass, grounding himself as the truth he sensed refused to stay quiet. Behind him, Lena rose slowly, her footsteps soft but heavy, as if every movement betrayed a secret she couldn't contain. Her reflection hovered beside his in the window, hers trembling, his hardened. She whispered his name, barely audible, and the sound cracked something inside him. He turned, searching her face for a version of her that hadn't slipped away yet. The space between them folded inwards as Lena stepped closer, her breath uneven, her eyes shimmering with the truth she kept swallowing. Ethan's heart thudded in uneasy patterns. The room felt too small for the weight hovering between them, every second stretching like it wanted to snap. She reached for his hand, hesitated, then let it drop. The gesture wounded him more than any admission could have. He wanted to believe her, to cling to the girl who once trusted him with her whole heart. But tonight she looked like someone rehearsing a story she didn't fully believe. His pulse quickened, the fear of what she might say more terrifying than the silence. When she finally opened her mouth, her voice cracked on the first word. The truth didn't come. Instead, Lena stepped back as if retreating from something she wasn't ready to face. Ethan watched her chest rise and fall in uneven waves, mirroring the storm inside him. Somewhere between them, trust fractured with a sound he could almost hear. She kept insisting nothing happened, but her voice shook like she feared the world might collapse if she spoke honestly. Ethan felt the ache of knowing too much and not enough at the same time. He imagined the night she claimed to just talk. Imagined shadows, imagined hands, imagined everything she refused to say. The pain sharpened, carving a hollow behind his ribs. When Lena finally met his eyes again, the question hanging between them was one neither dared to ask. What really happened? Morning crept into the apartment like an uninvited guest, pale and cold, stripping away whatever comfort the night pretended to offer. Ethan sat at the edge of the couch, untouched coffee cooling beside him, replaying Lena's uneven breaths and trembling hands. She moved around the kitchen quietly, each soft clatter echoing like a reminder of the distance they couldn't close. He watched her from the doorway, how she avoided his eyes, how her shoulders tightened whenever he tried to speak. They were living in the same space but breathing entirely different air. He finally asked her again what happened last night, forcing the words past the heaviness in his chest. Lena froze, fingers hovering above the sink, and for a moment he saw her break, just slightly, but enough. That fragile flicker terrified him more than any confession she could give. Ethan followed her into the hallway as she grabbed her coat, the silence between them thick enough to swallow the morning. Lena insisted she had errands, but her voice sounded fragile, rehearsed like she'd practiced the excuse a dozen times. He reached for her arm, not to stop her but to steady himself, needing something to feel real. She stiffened before he even touched her. That tiny recoil sliced deeper than any shouted argument. He asked her again if there was something she wasn't telling him, and this time her eyes glassed over. She whispered no, but it was the kind of no built from walls, not truth. When she finally left, the door clicked shut with a softness that felt crueler than a slam. Hours crawled by before Ethan could think clearly again. The apartment felt foreign without Lena's presence, like the walls themselves held their breath. He paced the living room, replaying her quiet trembling, the way she couldn't look at him, the strange scent of cologne that still lingered in the air. Every detail gnawed at him, twisting into something darker. He checked his phone, hoping for a message from her, but the silence mocked him. He remembered the love they once shared. Simple, warm, honest. Now every memory felt like a warning he failed to notice in time. He wondered if something broke that couldn't be fixed, or if it had already shattered long before he realized. As the sun began to set, Ethan sank into the chair beside the window, watching shadows stretch across the room. The world outside moved normally. People passed, cars hummed. But everything inside him felt off balance. He replayed Lena's flinch, her strained voice, and the way she left without a backward glance. He felt guilt mixing with suspicion, both twisting like barbed wire. He wanted to trust her, to believe the story she clung to so tightly. But something in her eyes refused to align with her words. That soft, haunted look lingered in his mind, replaying each time he blinked. He wondered if love was supposed to be this painful, or if he had missed the moment it began to rot. By nightfall, Ethan couldn't sit still. He kept glancing at the door, waiting for Lena to return, hoping her expression would make sense of everything. Instead, hours passed in suffocating quiet. When he finally heard keys jingling outside, his pulse surged. The door opened slowly, and Lena stepped in, her expression unreadable, her hands trembling as she hung her coat. The moment she lifted her head, he saw it. The same look she had last night, the look her words kept contradicting. Fear. Guilt. Something she wasn't brave enough to say. Ethan swallowed hard, stepping toward her, feeling the divide between them like a physical ache. He whispered her name, and she froze, as though caught in a lie she no longer knew how to defend. The moment Lena stepped further into the apartment, Ethan felt the truth hovering between them like a storm cloud waiting to break. She kept her eyes lowered, rubbing her thumb nervously along the seam of her coat, a gesture he had never seen her do before. He asked her where she had been, trying to keep his voice steady, but the tremor in it betrayed him. Lena hesitated, inhaling sharply as though she needed to choose her next breath with caution. The silence stretched, pulling at the threads of trust until they strained. She finally whispered that she went for a walk, the same kind of soft, uncertain lie she had clung to last night. Ethan watched her chest rise and fall too quickly, watched her lips tremble like she wanted to say more, but couldn't. His heart pounded with fear and anger and love tangled together. He wondered if he was losing her, or if he already had. Ethan stepped closer, and Lena instinctively stepped back, the tiny motion cutting deeper than any confession. He remembered mornings when she leaned into him without thinking, when trust was effortless, when her smile didn't hide anything sharp. But tonight she looked like a stranger wearing the face he loved. He asked her again, quietly, firmly, What really happened last night? His voice carried the exhaustion of a man holding too many unanswered questions. Lena's lips parted, but no words came out. Her breath shuddered, and she pressed her hand to her chest as though steadying a guilt she could no longer keep buried. Ethan felt his throat tighten. The truth was close. He could feel it trembling in the space between them. Lena finally sat down on the edge of the bed as though her legs couldn't hold the weight of her silence anymore. Ethan stayed by the door, afraid that moving closer might push her further away. She stared down at her hands, fingers twisting together until her knuckles blanched. He watched her silently, every part of him begging for honesty, for something solid to hold on to. Lena whispered that she didn't mean to worry him, that she just needed space. But the words felt thin, fragile, incomplete. Ethan closed his eyes, fighting the sinking feeling that she was confessing nothing, because the real story was buried deeper. He felt the ache of wanting to believe her, battling the fear that believing her meant betraying himself. Ethan stepped inside the room, moving slowly as if afraid the air might shatter. Lena finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing, as though she wanted him to pull her back from something she couldn't escape alone. He knelt in front of her, searching her expression for any trace of the woman he knew, the woman who trusted him without hesitation. "Just tell me," he whispered. Lena's breath hitched, and her shoulders slumped as though she could no longer carry the weight of pretending. She whispered that she didn't know how to explain, that everything felt wrong, and she didn't know where to start. Her voice cracked, and Ethan felt the truth creeping closer, tightening around both of them like dusk closing in. Lena's voice finally steadied, and she said something Ethan didn't expect. "I'm not sure if I'm scared of what happened, or scared to tell you why." The words struck him like a blow, rattling the foundation beneath them. His breath shortened, his thoughts spiraling as he tried to understand. She looked away, tears filling her eyes before they could fall, her fingers gripping the blanket tightly. Ethan felt time distort around them, fear slipping down his spine. He asked her softly but firmly what she meant. Lena whispered that the night wasn't what he thought, but not because of betrayal, because of something worse, something she hadn't found the courage to speak aloud. Ethan felt the first shiver of dread. Whatever she was about to reveal, it would change everything. Ethan didn't breathe for a moment after hearing Lena's trembling words. The room felt smaller, the air tighter, as though her confession had shifted the gravity around them. She kept wiping her palms on her jeans, her hands shaking too much to stay still. He asked her gently what she meant. What could be worse than the truth he had feared all night? Lena's gaze flicked toward the window, as if afraid someone might be listening, and her silence carried the weight of something long buried. She whispered that something happened before she came home, something she didn't understand, something that still terrified her. Ethan stepped closer, wanting to protect her, even though a cold unease curled in his stomach. Her breath trembled, and she said she'd been followed by someone she recognized but hadn't seen in years. The tremor in her voice made Ethan's pulse stall. Whatever this was, it wasn't just guilt. It was fear. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine as Lena described walking home last night, hearing footsteps behind her even when the street was empty. She told him she kept glancing back, catching fleeting glimpses of someone tall, someone familiar, someone she prayed she was imagining. Her voice cracked as she admitted she didn't go straight to the apartment. She hid behind a closed cafe, shaking, trying to convince herself she was overreacting. Ethan listened in stunned silence, his anger dissolving into dread. He realized that her trembling earlier, her scattered words, the haunted look in her eyes, it wasn't betrayal at all. It was survival. And suddenly, he felt guilty for every doubt he had thrown at her. But as Lena continued, he sensed she still wasn't telling him everything. Lena finally confessed that the man she thought she saw was someone she once knew, someone she hoped she'd never cross paths with again. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched her struggle with the memory. the kind that leaves marks only the heart can feel. She said she wasn't sure if she imagined it, but the certainty in her voice betrayed her doubt. Ethan stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on her arm, telling her she wasn't alone. But Lena flinched, not because of him, but because saying the man's name seemed to terrify her. She told Ethan that this person had hurt her before, years ago, in ways she never talked about. And last night, his presence felt too real to ignore. Ethan felt rage simmer beneath his skin, protective and dangerous. Ethan's voice deepened as he asked her why she never told him about this man before. What had happened? Why she carried this fear alone? Lena looked ashamed, as though the past had followed her into the room and wrapped its fingers around her throat. She explained that she had tried to leave that part of her life behind, convincing herself it couldn't touch her again. But last night, the shadows shifted, and everything she buried began clawing its way back. Ethan reached for her hand slowly this time, giving her room to pull away if she needed to. She didn't. Instead, she gripped his fingers with desperate strength. He promised he would protect her, that she didn't have to hide anymore. Yet Lena shook her head, tears welling, whispering that the danger wasn't just about the man. Something else happened last night that she still couldn't bring herself to say. Lena took a shaky breath, and Ethan felt the entire room hold still as if bracing for her next words. She confessed that the worst part wasn't seeing someone from her past. It was what he said to her. Ethan's pulse hammered, fear and anger tangling inside him as Lena closed her eyes, repeating the man's words in a broken whisper. He told me he knows where I live now. And he's not done. The sentence sliced through the air, sharp and undeniable. Ethan felt a rush of protective fury, but beneath it was something colder. An understanding that last night wasn't an accident or a coincidence. Lena opened her eyes, tears finally falling, and whispered that she didn't come home late because she was hiding from Ethan. She came home late because she was hiding from the man who promised he would return. And now that he knew where she was, everything would change. Ethan stood frozen, Lena's trembling confession echoing through him long after her voice broke into silence. The room felt colder now, shadows stretching across the walls like they were listening, waiting. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to erase every trace of fear etched into her face, but the truth she revealed sat between them like a fracture neither could step over. Lena kept wiping her cheeks with shaky fingers, apologizing for things she never owed him an apology for. Ethan stepped closer, trying to keep his voice calm, telling her she didn't have to explain anything else tonight, but she shook her head fiercely, saying she couldn't live with another secret clawing at her. He saw the determination in her hazel eyes, fear mixed with a desperate need to be understood. She whispered that the man who followed her didn't just speak to her. He reached for her. Ethan's heart slammed painfully. Everything inside him shifted, and the night began to feel like a threshold they could never cross back over. Lena's voice shook as she described the moment a man stepped out from behind the shadows near the cafe. She said she froze, unable to run, unable to breathe. Ethan listened with a cold fury spiraling through him. She explained how he whispered her name like a threat, how his smile didn't reach his eyes, how he stood too close. So close she felt, trapped in the ghost of her past. Ethan's jaw tightened at every detail, the urge to protect her clashing violently with the helplessness of not having been there. Lena admitted she pushed him away and ran, but something in her tone made Ethan realize she wasn't telling him the whole story. She paused, staring at her hands as if they held the missing pieces. Ethan stepped closer, urging her to continue, bracing himself for a truth he felt forming like a storm. Lena finally whispered the part that made her voice break. He didn't just reach for her. His fingers brushed her arm before she pulled away. The contact was brief, but enough to send her spiraling back into memories she fought years to bury. Ethan felt something snap inside him, a cold rage that left his hands shaking. He knelt in front of her, telling her she didn't have to face this alone anymore. Lena lifted her eyes, and for the first time that night, he saw a flicker of hope beneath the fear. But then she said there was something worse. The man told her he had been watching her for days. A tightness formed in Ethan's chest as the reality settled. They weren't dealing with a random encounter. This was planned, intentional, dangerous. The air in the room thickened, and Ethan felt the shift like an invisible weight. Their lives had crossed into something darker than suspicion or doubt. This was survival. Ethan rose to his feet with newfound resolve, pacing the room as he tried to process the threat closing in on them. Lena watched him with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Her body curled in on itself like she was trying to make her presence smaller. He told her they needed to call someone. Police, a friend, anyone. But Lena shook her head violently. She insisted they wouldn't believe her, that this man had a way of twisting everything, of making her doubt her own memory. Ethan felt helplessness claw at him, but he refused to let it take over. He promised her they would face this together, that he wouldn't let anything happen to her again. She exhaled shakily, whispering that she wished she could believe that. Ethan sat beside her, gently taking her hand. The world outside felt silent, too silent, as if listening for their next move. Night deepened, wrapping the apartment in an unsettling stillness. Ethan noticed the way Lena kept glancing toward the windows, flinching at every passing car light. He closed the curtains, locking the door twice, every motion driven by instinctive fear. Lena finally whispered that she hadn't told him the last part, the reason she hesitated to come home. Ethan turned slowly, dread pulsing through him. She said after she ran, she hid behind the dumpsters near the alley. And that's when she heard him again. His voice, low and certain, echoing just feet away. He wasn't chasing. He was waiting because he knew exactly where she would go. Ethan felt ice crawl across his spine. Lena finally met his gaze and whispered the sentence that would change the night completely. He said he'd come back tonight. The apartment seemed to exhale, as though the walls themselves knew something was coming. The silence between them thickened as the truth settled into the corners of the apartment like a cold draft. Ethan felt every muscle tighten, alert and bracing, as if expecting the door to burst open at any second. Lena sat curled into herself, her breaths thin and shaky, staring at the shadows as though they held the memory of the man's voice. Ethan crouched in front of her, trying to steady his own breathing so she wouldn't hear the fear clawing at him. He promised her they would get through this night, that he wouldn't let anyone touch her again. But doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. The way Lena kept glancing at the door made him question whether she believed any place was safe anymore. He reached for her trembling hands, grounding her, grounding himself. She whispered that she didn't want him getting hurt because of her. Ethan swallowed hard. Love had never felt this terrifying, and neither had the quiet. Ethan stood and moved toward the window with deliberate caution, pulling the curtains tighter while scanning the street below. The glow of street lamps spilled across empty pavement, too still for comfort. He froze when he noticed a dark corner across the street that seemed deeper than it should be, as if swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. His chest tightened. He asked Lena if the man had ever said anything about watching from outside before, but she shook her head, whispering that he was always unpredictable. Ethan locked the window, each click of the latch breaking the silence like a warning. Lena's hands gripped the blanket until her knuckles went white. She murmured that she could still hear his voice in her mind, the way he said her name with a certainty that made her skin crawl. Ethan turned to her, jaw clenched. The night no longer felt like time passing. It felt like something closing in. The apartment suddenly felt suffocating, as though every wall leaned inward. Ethan paced the room, running a hand through his hair while Lena traced shaky circles across her knee to keep herself grounded. She said she had spent years trying to forget what that man put her through, convincing herself he wouldn't find her again. But last night shattered that illusion. Ethan stopped pacing and stared at her, feeling guilt wedge itself deep inside him. Guilt for doubting her, guilt for every moment he didn't realize she was battling a fear she kept buried. Lena's voice softened as she told him she didn't blame him for anything, and the tenderness in her words broke him a little. But before Ethan could answer, a faint noise rattled the quiet. A soft metallic tap. His heart stopped. Lena's breath caught. And suddenly, the world shrank to a single point of terror. Ethan held his breath, listening. The tap came again, soft, deliberate, like someone testing the strength of the door. Lena's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with terror. Ethan moved slowly, motioning for her to stay silent. His pulse thudded violently against his ribs as he stepped closer to the door, every instinct screaming at him to keep distance, but every protective impulse pushing him forward. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Ethan could hear his own breathing, shallow and sharp. He pressed his ear to the door, jaw clenched. For a moment, he thought he heard nothing. Then, soft breathing on the other side, a slow exhale that wasn't his. Ethan backed away, eyes wide. Lena whispered his name, barely audible. He didn't turn. His gaze stayed locked on the door, dread tightening like a fist around his spine. The breathing outside the door faded, replaced by footsteps moving slowly down the hall. Ethan felt a chill ripple through him as he realized the man wasn't trying to break in. He was lingering, reminding them he was close. Lena whispered that she couldn't go through this again, her voice barely a thread holding her together. Ethan hurried back to her, placing his hands on her shoulders, promising they would leave if they had to, that he wouldn't let her stay trapped in fear another second. But as he said the words, a new sound echoed through the hall, a soft scrape, like metal dragging lightly against the floor. Ethan and Lena locked eyes, terror mirrored in both of their expressions. The scrape repeated, slower this time, deliberate. Ethan felt his breath lodge in his throat. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The scraping outside the door finally stopped, but the quiet it left behind felt even more threatening. Ethan could hear Lena's breath hitching, soft and uneven, as she clutched his sleeve like she was trying to anchor herself to something steady. He guided her to her feet, whispering that they needed to move. Now, the apartment no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. Lena nodded shakily, wiping her tear-wet cheeks as she tried to gather the courage she'd spent years rebuilding. Ethan grabbed his phone and keys, forcing his mind to stay clear even as fear pulsed through him. He told her they would go somewhere safe, somewhere that man would never find. But Lena looked toward the door, eyes wide and haunted, whispering that safety might not exist anymore, not while he was out there, watching. Ethan took her hand and squeezed gently, promising they wouldn't face this night alone. Not anymore. In forward scouts, his naturally message created distress. I'll freight. Ethan moved cautiously toward the front door, listening for any sign of movement in the hallway. Lena stayed close behind him, each step heavy with dread. He pressed his hand around the doorknob but hesitated, sensing the quiet wasn't natural. It felt like someone waiting to hear their next move. Lena whispered that maybe they should leave through the back staircase instead. Ethan nodded, thankful she still had the strength to think through her fear. They crept toward the kitchen doorway leading to the rear exit, each floorboard creaking louder than it should. Ethan felt the tension gnaw at him, pulling tighter with every step. Lena's fingers brushed his back as if to make sure he hadn't disappeared into the dark. They reached the door to the stairwell, and Ethan pressed his ear against it, praying for silence. But silence wasn't what he heard. He heard breathing, slow, steady, waiting on the other side. Ethan jerked back from the door, pulse racing as he shook his head silently to warn Lena. She covered her mouth, swallowing a sob that threatened to escape. They had no way out, not through the hall, not through the stairs. The realization hit them like a blow. Ethan pulled Lena behind the kitchen counter, crouching with her as he tried to steady his breathing. He whispered that the man must have been watching both exits, waiting for the moment they would panic. Lena's whole body trembled against him, her tears falling silently onto his sleeve. Ethan knew calling for help might be their only chance, but his hands shook as he reached for his phone. The signal flickered. One bar, then none. As he stared at the dead screen, the lights in the apartment flickered once, twice, then went black. The blackout swallowed the room, turning every sound into a threat. Lena pressed closer, her trembling breaths brushing against Ethan's shoulder. He reached for her hand and held it tightly, whispering that she wasn't alone. A faint creak echoed from the hallway. Slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. Ethan felt his skin crawl, his instincts sharpening like broken glass. The footsteps dragged closer, stopping just beyond the kitchen wall. Lena squeezed his hand so tightly it hurt. Ethan leaned in, whispering a plan so quietly he could barely hear it himself. They would run the moment the man stepped into the living room, heading straight for the window fire escape. Lena nodded through her tears. The footsteps paused completely, leaving behind a silence that felt like the moment before a scream. Then a soft knock. 3 gentle taps on the kitchen doorway filled the darkness. The soft knocking stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt like a presence of its own. Ethan forced himself to move, pulling Lena toward the living room window where the fire escape beckoned like their last remaining lifeline. He lifted the window quietly, praying the rusted frame wouldn't squeal. Lena crawled through first, her breath visible in the cold night air. Ethan followed, glancing over his shoulder into the dark apartment one last time. His heart slammed when he saw it, a faint silhouette standing in the doorway they had just fled from, motionless, watching. Ethan grabbed the window frame and pulled it shut as fast as he dared, the glass trembling under his hands. Lena whispered his name, her voice breaking as she pointed down the metal stairs. Ethan looked, and his blood ran cold. A second silhouette stood at the bottom of the fire escape. They weren't escaping. They were surrounded.